Well, good morning and happy Thursday, everyone, and welcome to the Florida Healthcare Association's webinar series on the patient-driven payment model. I'm Melanie Motiska, Quality Improvement and Education Manager for the Florida Healthcare Association. Let's get some housekeeping notes out of the way so we can get started with today's great program. Due to the large number of participants, all attendees are muted. We encourage you to use the computer audio rather than a telephone to maintain sound quality for today's presentation. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by typing your questions into the question box on your control panel. You may also email me directly with your questions at mmotiska@fhca.org. This webinar is being recorded, and an online archive will be available in the members-only section of the Florida Healthcare Association website. If you have a colleague unable to join us today, please encourage them to view the recorded webinar. I would now like to introduce today's speaker. Pam Kaiser, Vice President of Provider Services at PointRight Incorporated, has enjoyed 25 years in the healthcare field. A second career for Pam, she worked her way from a certified nursing assistant through the long-term care ranks to become a leader in clinical reimbursement and compliance for several large long-term care providers. She has a BA in advertising from Michigan State University and an MSN in community health nursing from the University of Southern Maine. Please visit the PointRight website at pointright.com after today's webinar. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter, Pam Kaiser of PointRight.
Great, thanks, Melanie. I appreciate that introduction. And just a moment here, I'll share my screen. And I wanted to actually thank the association and for pulling this really great series together. I was really happy to be part of it and talk about some things that are near and dear to my heart, meaning mainly clinical reimbursement and the new payment system that's coming up, and also compliance, which is where the phase 3 requirements of participation overlap with what's happening with PDPM. So thanks for pulling this all together, and let's go ahead and get started. What I hope that folks leave today with is an idea, again, of where the phase 3 requirements intersect with the new payment model, the patient-driven payment model that's coming up this October, that you have some aha moments around PDPM, things you might not have thought of, things that you might want to consider as we move forward on this journey, and also with some things that you want to take back to your center, to your teams to review and make sure that you're covering in preparation and then into the future when we're operating under this new model and the new requirements. And then also a vision for the way forward. So as folks probably know by now, back in October of 16, CMS revised the rules of participation. They hadn't done that in quite a while. They had just been submitting new letters of certification and letters that came out to the surveyors, and they had all these different references, different time frames. They've updated everything, so now it's all in, the watermelon book, as we used to call it, is all up to date. All the information is in there. And they moved through that in basically 3 different phases. It was a lot to change for the providers to do it all at once, so they stepped us through it. Phase 1 started in 2016, and now we have phase 3 that's going to be starting basically 2 months after PDPM goes into place at the end of November of this year. When we look at the phase 3 opportunities, there's really new programs, new policies, new staff position, and new education and training that are required. And basically for the new PMPs that are coming up, you have to have in place a compliance and ethics policy and procedure. In addition, you have to update your QAPI programs to include areas of how you're getting your feedback, where you're collecting your data, and how you're monitoring your process, and also that you have a systematic approach for quality improvement. So there have been parts of the QAPI program in each of the 3 phases so far, and this last phase is sort of tying it up in a nice bow, talking about how are you going to get your feedback, when you get your data, what are you going to do with it, and how are you going to monitor performance. So it's sort of wrapping that all up. The compliance and ethics program, although folks probably have some type of compliance program in place now, they really want to formalize it with policies and procedures and education. When we look at some staff position and certification requirements that are included in the Phase 3 rules, in some instances, well, you have to have a compliance contact for each center. Someone has to oversee the compliance program. You have to have, in some cases, a compliance officer and liaison, and you have to have an infection preventionist as part of your QAPI team. You have to make sure that you, in addition to the other required education and training that's done annually, that you have QAPI education and training for your staff and the regular in-services addressing elements of the QAPI program. And you have to have education and training for all of your staff around compliance and ethics. We're looking at some processes, systems, and assessments that will be rolled into, into your program as part of the Phase 3 rules. And you really need to make sure that you have a system in your facility to collect data from all departments and to identify what your key performance indicators are and outline what your process or your system will be to monitor them. You want to have a system that's able to, from a compliance perspective, detect any compliance violations and allow staff to report that, and also make sure that the data that you're reporting in your systems is accurate. Here's some of the citations that are associated with the QAPI program. I'm not going to go through those, but there are quite a few for each of the different elements. And then also there's some cross tags that they've included. We have some citations for the training that I spoke of, so you have to make sure that that's something that's documented and able to be produced for your surveyors. And we also have a little bit a deeper dive into what's intended or needed in order to say that you have a compliance and ethics program. You have to have, as I mentioned, policies and procedures actually drafted. And in those policies and procedures, it's got to be more than just paper compliance. You have to make sure that your P&P around compliance and ethics is promoting quality of care or quality care delivery. And that program has to be set up in such a way that it could really detect or be reasonably capable, as the actual language, of detecting violations, whether they're criminal violations, civil violations, or just violations of your policy. And you need to also make sure that part and parcel to your compliance and ethics program is you have somebody who heads it up, and that staff can report to them in a way that there's no retribution for reporting issues or concerns. In some cases, they have to be able to, you could consider having them be able to report anonymously if they don't feel comfortable. But one of the things that you can bet that folks will be looking for when they come into your center is if they go up to somebody on the unit and ask them who your compliance liaison, or if you have an issue or a concern around care, who do you report that to? They should be able to name that person. And so the other thing is you also have to be able to, it shouldn't be a static type of process. You need to be able to modify your systems as needed. So as changes come through from regulatory environment, from your state, different elements that you need to be able to monitor and attend to, you want to be able to include that in your compliance and ethics program as necessary. To be able to be flexible when you're looking at your compliance and ethics program, because there's always new rules, new regulations, new concerns that states, entities, and federal entities are concerned about. So you need to be able to modify your program to accommodate any changes. In addition to having someone who is the individual that's identified for your staff, your vendors, your family members as being the person that you would go to if you have issues or concerns. You also need to make sure that you have folks if you are in a chain, that you have somebody that's designated as a compliance officer. If it's a standalone, that you have someone who fulfills that role as well. And they are responsible for oversight for the entire program. And in order to do that, they also have to have the authority and the resources to execute whatever compliance plan you've identified, either as a standalone or your consultants have devised that is standardized throughout the organization. So there has to be somebody at the head of the company who can make decisions, can execute the plan, and has the resources and authority to do so. When we look at compliance and ethics, there are some elements that are also spelled out. So when you're devising your program, you need to make sure that you include them as well. You need to be sure that you're screening your employees to make sure that they haven't had any issues with civil, criminal, or administrative violations under the Social Security Act. Most of the time we do a good job of doing background checks on hire, but there's a consideration that you might want to do that on a more regular basis after folks are even employed. You want to make sure that you're communicating what your plan is as far as compliance, whether it's the policies and procedures, your standards of performance. Make sure that everybody is thoroughly trained in your center so they understand the commitment that your organization has to compliance and ethics. And you also have to have a way to monitor those elements, right? To make sure that you have systems where you can reasonably identify that there's a potential for compliance risk here, and then be able to mitigate that. You have to, if you spell out in your compliance program, in your ethics program, disciplinary actions, you have to make sure that you abide by them. And that also includes people who don't report. We have to make sure that people feel comfortable reporting, that they, if they can't report, on their own and they need to do it anonymously, that they have an easy way to do that. But you also have to hold folks accountable if they don't report compliance violations. And you have to, when somebody identifies a concern, you have to make sure that you attend to that in a fairly professional, rigorous manner. You can't really dismiss someone's compliance concern. You have to investigate that timely, and you have to have documentation that the investigation was held, what happened and what the conclusions were. And as I mentioned, if you have a larger organization, so in the regulation it says 5 or more, you have to have mandatory training for your ethics and compliance program for all of your employees, and has to be done annually. As I mentioned, you have to have a compliance officer, and their primary responsibility is execution and oversight for your compliance and ethics program. And they have to have stature in your organization such that they are, part of the governing body, that they are, right up there with the decision makers and identifying issues or concerns so that the entire team can act on them. So they have to have the same standing. As I mentioned, they needed the authority and resources to execute the plan. And in a case where your organization has 5 or more centers, they also have to be on the par with the GC or the CFO or COO. And in each of the individual centers, you also have to have a compliance liaison. So it's an infrastructure that's built into the operational fabric of your organization. So that was the compliance and ethics component. The QAPI portion, as I mentioned, there were requirements in the phase 1 component. There's QAPI requirements in the phase 2. And now in phase 3, we're updating the whole program to include policies and procedures that speak to how you're going to gather feedback, how you're going to get your data, because your QAPI program has to be data driven. So how are you going to get that information? How are you going to use it? And then what's your process for monitoring? So specifically, they do mention adverse event monitoring. So that's one of the things that definitely has to be on your agenda and has to be, you have to be looking for feedback and data on that information and making decisions on the adverse event monitoring. And you also have to include in your revised PMP for QAPI, how are you going to maintain your systems to collect that feedback, that you're going to get it from a wide variety of people, that it's not just one narrow spot that you're going to for your data. And you also want to talk about how you use that data to prioritize what you're going to address in your QAPI program. Ideally, you know, for the biggest bang for your buck, you want to address elements in your center that are high risk, that are high volume, meaning they happen, you know, something that happens a lot, that you want to be able to monitor that it's happening properly, or something that's problem prone. So all of those are elements you want to look at when you make a decision within your QAPI team as to what's going to take priority. So things that are high risk, you know, maybe they don't happen that much, but it's, you know, very risky when it does happen. Or maybe it's something that's just particularly challenging from being just problematic in and of itself. So you need to prioritize those and talk about in your P&P how you're going to monitor those and get that feedback from your staff. And then also, you know, how are you going to use the data from all departments? Not just using that facility assessment, which is really important to do, provides you with a lot of insight in how you want to approach your education and training and process improvement, those sorts of things. But you want to make sure that you get performance indicators from other areas as well. So again, you want to make sure that you have a clear way of monitoring, developing, and evaluating what your performance indicators are going to be, and that you include that methodology in your program and also what the frequency is to be doing those. Obviously, you're not going to monitor everything every day. You may have different intervals and you may have a schedule. Lots of teams do that where they, you know, the first quarter they address these particular issues, second quarter they address different issues and cycle through their main concerns from a process improvement or quality assurance program in that manner. And again, they do stipulate that you have to monitor for adverse events. How are you going to do that should be spelled out. And another element that they absolutely included in their agenda was any resident rights violations need to be attended to, resolved, and then, you know, how can organizationally we be sure that doesn't happen again. So remember when we're talking about rules of participation or requirements for participation more correctly, the QAPI and compliance, because we'll see how that's going to become part and parcel in your PDPM program. So how did we get to the patient-driven payment model? Well, fairly simply, we started in cost base, we moved into RUGs. There's been a lot of revisions and changes to that, but it's all of our payment systems have always been built off of the minimum data set. So the MDS has always been front and center in any of our payment systems. What we're really looking at now is this concept of moving out to value away from volume. You've probably heard that many times. It's not the amount of therapy that we're delivering anymore that's going to determine what we're going to get paid. It's the value that we provide. And, you know, the reimbursement is always under scrutiny and it's always been criticized. You know, there's always, as I mentioned, you know, there's this ongoing concern about reimbursement abuse. You know, every time you see the OIG or MedPAC or the, you know, the association, the GAO talk about reimbursement, they're always questioning, you know, are we delivering what's medically reasonable and appropriate? Are we delivering services in order to inflate our reimbursement? You know, what's the rationale behind our process? And, you know, it's kind of justified in some ways because every iteration of RUGs, we see changes in behavior and treatment delivery. And if you just look at the PEPR reports, predominantly everyone is in the ultra high rehab category. We see lots of folks get therapy who are very independent with their ADLs. You know, the change of therapy, MDSs, you know, that had to be instituted because of practice patterns with delivery of stuff. So, you know, they sort of have reason to be concerned. And so the American Healthcare Act, you know, that came through, sometimes called Obamacare, really was the first time that we moved away from volume to value. And so although PDPM isn't a value-based purchasing program. It's a movement away from volume. It's an eye to making the resident condition front and center of how folks are getting reimbursed. And it's, again, part of this movement away from just how much stuff can we deliver, how many tests can we do and get paid for. It's to what's the end result, better resident care, happier residents, that kind of thing. Really, the idea behind this, when we moved into PDPM or are going to move into PDPM, is to make sure that the SNF providers are accurately compensated for the work that they do, and to look at some of these reverse incentives that seem to make the reimbursement the reason why we deliver services and not the need of the resident. So it's kind of to flip that on its head and put the resident back in the center of the care continuum, and to maintain simplicity, which it's kind of funny. We do have many fewer assessments to do, but it's not a simple reimbursement program by any means. And those are the same goals that we're striving for now. Again, moving from volume to value, we look at some of the elements of PDPM that sort of point to that. Payment is based absolutely on the resident. We have to have verifiable characteristics in the medical record, diagnoses in the medical record, a good picture of the resident in the medical record, and it's not based on just therapy. We still have to provide therapy. They're still going to be, we'll still be capturing that information on the MDS, but it's not the volume of therapy that's driving a reimbursement. The nice part about PDPM is it does account for some of these ancillary costs that might not have been considered or were masked by the therapy delivery in the past. We all know we can have somebody who's in a rehab ultra high with, B, medium, middle of the road ADL needs, and we can have two patients that have the exact same RUG category and payment level, and one costs us a lot more to provide care to because of the other ancillary costs. Again, as I mentioned, there are going to be fewer assessments to get to those rates, and reimbursement does adjust automatically over time. So when we look at the payment process, if someone is in your building 21 days, on day 21, there's a 2% reduction in the case mix for your PT and OT. So it's still a good deal from a reimbursement perspective, but there is this adjustment over time. And then there's more case mix components that are used in determining the methodology, which also is good for us. You're probably accustomed to seeing this particular slide. It was in the final rule and in the technical guide, but essentially, again, the patient is front and center. We have 5 case mix adjusted components: PT, OT, speech, nursing, and non-therapy ancillaries. And then we have this one non-case mix adjusted component, which is consistent with what we have now. The way that the case mix payment is adjusted is we start with, the ICD-10 code, and we get the base rate for PT. We multiply that by the CMI associated with that particular diagnostic category, and by the adjustment factor. We do the same thing for OT, and then for speech, there's no adjustment factor, so it's just the base rate and the speech case mix index. Same thing for nursing, and then when we get to the NTAs, there's an adjustment factor that is included in the methodology, and then there's a base rate for the non-case mix, and all those added up together give you your rate for PDPM. So we hear a lot of interesting things when we start to talk about changes that are coming, or people's reaction to the changes that they perceive in PDPM. One of the ones that we hear a lot is, oh, I'm just going to cut my MDS staff. And really, when you start to think about that, yes, there are going to be fewer assessments. When PointRight did research and analysis on this, it looked like it'd be about a 15% drop in the number of assessments. So not, some, but not a whole lot at the end of the day. And then when CMS talked about, how much of a savings it was going to be, they did a little calculation in the proposed rule and the final rule, indicating that it was going to save the sector about $1 million $1 million, over almost $2 million as a savings to the industry by removing some of these assessments. And when you do the math on the total, it really comes out to only being about $12,500 per center per year. So it's not a big, I mean, it's a savings, but it's not that big of a savings. The idea that folks are not going to deliver therapy at the same level that they do now is really short-sighted. We are reporting that on the discharge assessment and on any assessment that we would do in between. It will certainly be on the OBRA assessment. CMS has a long timeline, a very deep pile of MDSs and practice patterns that they can look at, the PEPR reports that have been out for years. So folks that are saying that they're thinking they're not going to deliver therapy are really going to be in trouble. This idea that we're going to have new patients coming in, well, the patients on October 1st will be the same type of patients you get on September 30th. It's just that there's going to be different areas we're going to be focusing on when we start to look at documentation. And also, we hear people saying that less sophisticated providers are going to be exiting the sector. I mean, I'm not quite sure how you define what's less sophisticated. Is that, you're not in a chain, or, it really is fairly nebulous. And then the other thing that we hear too is, that we need to hire a hospital ICD-10 coder, or somebody that's, expert in that area. And, there's a lot of discussion around that. It's certainly important. It's certainly a competency that people have to have. But folks are using ICD-10 codes now. They may be using a smaller subset, and they need to widen their knowledge base, but it's something to be practical about rather than have a knee-jerk reaction. So let's take a look at a case here. This is Mrs. Jane Q, who's come into the SNF. This is the diagnosis that she's come in with. Here are the functional scores. She has a mechanically altered diet, a diagnosis of malnutrition, and a PDHQ-9 score of 10. And so that puts her, when we run her through the CMS provided information, puts her in an other orthopedic clinical category, drops her into the HIPS code of TG for OT and PT, puts her, if her speech, in the SE category, which means that she's because of her cognitive impairment and mechanically altered diet, she's an ND for the non-therapy ancillaries because she's got COPD and malnutrition, and she has a nursing category that she falls into. So her payment, based on all of those elements together, would be, in this example, around $668.85. If we miss the diagnosis of malnutrition, the payment drops down to $639. If we also miss speech, cognitive impairment for speech, then their HIPS category is going to drop. If we also miss the depression, coding depression on the MDS, the payment's going to drop even further. And so in a 20-day stay, missing just malnutrition is going to cost you $780. Cognitive impairment, a little bit less than that. And then missing depression is going to be $782 over 20 days. So you can see how those things start to add up when you look at this particular resident. And again, she's, based on her characteristics, her primary diagnosis puts her in the clinical category of other orthopedic. If we drop her into, if the primary or the principal diagnosis code for her coming to the SNF is the COPD, she had an exacerbation, she's going to be in a different clinical category, and that will result in a different PT and OT category. But your other categories are going to remain the same. Your payment is going to be less. She's going to be, so it's about $14 less than if this resident, than the prior scenario. Again, missing each of these components is going to have an influence on your score, on your reimbursement, to the tune of, if you miss all of them, you're down to $575.10. So important, conceptually, just trying to show you the difference between one ICD-10 code and another ICD-10 code at the get-go from the clinical category. But then also, if you're not coding your MDS accurately, you're going to miss some of these other elements as well, and it will have a direct impact on your revenue. So how can you anticipate success under PDPM? One, I've heard it among my colleagues referred to as a patients-driven payment model. It's new. It's we're going to have to work through the process. We're going to have to identify what we're going to monitor. Again, we start to talk about QAPI in a little bit. You'll start to see some elements to pay attention to. But like anything, you're going to have some hiccups when you start. You can do everything you can to prepare, but you just need to make sure that you have good monitoring systems in place and have an idea of how to, make course correct as you learn. You need to make also to anticipate success. You want to think about, your therapy contracts. You've probably started or well down that path by this point in time. But when you're looking to renew your contract with your therapy group, what would that look like, and how would that be different? Think about how your MDS coordinator role is going to transition. I'm really not recommending cutting anybody right now until you sort of see what till the dust settles after all those assessment, the big changes happen. And, you might find your MDS coordinator is not so much a traffic cop, directing traffic and keeping the assessment flow going, but maybe they do more of, they're more active in actual care coordination and the transition care coordination as they move through the healthcare system, and maybe have the opportunity to do a better job with some of the assessments that are happening because there's time to do them in a thoughtful way. Again, do you have someone who maybe is not ICD-10 certified, but is certainly educated and trained and is the champion, the go-to person that you have when there are questions? Making sure that your teams are educated and that happens more than once. As I mentioned, they might find things that you need to tweak along the way. So as you learn and educate the team on those changes, that's going to be critical. Make sure that your key financial drivers are evaluated and benchmarked, and that you look at them periodically to make sure that you're on the right path. Again, when we start to think about compliance programs, what can you monitor, and how can you set up that monitoring system to make sure that you're capturing any potential areas of concern, particularly around coding. And then, do some practice assessments, obviously, ahead of time. Sort of what does that look like? What would be the ICD-10 code that's most appropriate for them coming into the SNF? And then also, your compliance plan that's required under QAPI is going to have to be adjusted, and probably, if you were, be wise to adjust it to these PDPM financial drivers. One of the folks that we work with who is a REIT managing lots of properties for many SNFs, is concerned about compliance too. And so this is kind of where, you have dollars in a new system, and you also have a requirement for participation coming up for compliance and ethics, and this would be probably something that would be front and center in any compliance and ethics program. Things that CMS is looking for. John Kane, who's one of the CMS, he's been with CMS for quite a while, working in their reimbursement department. In this last training he did a couple of weeks ago, really was very clear that they're going to be looking for changes in coding patterns, practice patterns that are different. As I mentioned, they have lots and lots of MDSs in their data bank. They've seen these practice patterns for a long time and seen the changes that the industry has instituted as each time rugs have changed. So they're on the lookout for that. They're looking for outliers for these key financial drivers, so you should be on the lookout for those as well. They're concerned that 720 minutes was absolutely necessary for that particular resident 6 days a week. On September 30th, that resident isn't going to change come October 1st. And so making sure that we're delivering reasonable and necessary therapy to those residents, just like we've been doing right along, is going to be key. And then also they're looking to see for this interim payment assessment where you have the opportunity, it's a voluntary assessment, you have the opportunity if someone substantially changes in their clinical outlook, and it's not something that it's going to self-correct in 14 days or so, you have the opportunity to do another assessment. And so they'll be watching because they certainly know how often we've done sig change assessments. They certainly know when we've done changes in therapy assessments, so they'll know if the IPA seems to be overused. And they did mention in the final rule that they'd be watching for that and meeting with stakeholders. They have not really laid out examples of when to do an IPA. They've left that up to the SNFs. They said that in this case, they believe that, we know the needs of the residents and the changes of the residents better than they do, and they don't want to regulate anything at this time. But they will be going back to stakeholders at some point, and if they see overuse of IPA, they'll probably put some guardrails around that as well. So how do you fulfill two needs where, we need to meet the rules and the requirements of participation, and we also need to make sure that we are doing the right thing with the new payment system that's coming up. So phase 3 readiness and PDPM excellence, how do we meet those two needs? Well, good care and accurate reimbursement, and both of those start with a good MDS assessment. It's the root of everything, really. It's behind reimbursement. It's what informs the quality measures. It's what's out in the public domain, and it all comes from the MDS. We work with a lot of MDSs at PointRight, and we look at MDS integrity. And in 2018, we looked at assessments with ARDs from January through July, which is based almost 24,000 MDS assessments, and we looked for issues. 79% of those assessments had issues, and they were concerns around, led us to believe there was issues or concerns with their data quality. They were, they could have been false positives or negatives. They were inaccurate. They led to inaccurate case mix, care plans, survey outcomes. So when we start to think about QAPI and taking the first step to improve that, MDS accuracy as a QAPI program really is also the start of a compliance program, because that delivering quality care is critical and is identified, on the MDS through the care planning, through the quality measures. And it also is, part and parcel of your reimbursement. So being able to look at, I'm sure you probably have an MDS accuracy QAPI program now, and you look at certain elements of the MDS to ensure that they're coded correctly. You probably have some sort of, standardized number of assessments you look at over a certain interval of time. And you have a threshold that if you trip that, then you have to take corrective action, whatever that might be. So now all you need to do is look to see under PDPM, what are some of the financial drivers that you want to monitor now? You may want to continue to look at therapy for a bit to make sure that that doesn't change in your delivery, but you may want to integrate some other elements into that program, and have QAPI become part of your compliance plan at the same time. So here's one of the things that we do. We look at, again, some of these outliers and benchmark them. So if you have a mechanically altered diet or signs or symptoms of depression, it's okay for me to know how I'm doing, but how do I compare against others? So if I know I'm different in some way, shape, or fashion. So there's one way to do it. The other way you can do it, if you don't know, is look at your own facility rates for some of these rate drivers. And then look to see from your facility rates, how do you compare to national numbers? And these are the national numbers right now. So this particular center is a little bit higher in their capture of depression, higher in their swallowing disorders. And then, here's their mechanically altered diet and cognitive impairment. But let's, look how you do on the 14-day. And so in this case, when they did the analysis of how they were managing under their 14-day, look like a couple of things. One, they adjusted some of the rates, and two, they didn't capture that on the first assessment. With PDPM, it's really going to be important that your first assessment, that initial 5-day, for lack of a different name, captures things like depression, captures these elements that are part of your non-therapy ancillaries, because they have direct impact on your reimbursement. So here is a gentleman that I'm guessing a lot of folks don't necessarily know. His name is Avedis Donabedian. I've used him because it's a framework that I've always found helpful when I'm trying to work towards a quality assurance, performance improvement type of arrangement. And he's a gentleman that was a physician, and he did a lot of work in healthcare and medical outcomes research, and devised a very simple but elegant model called the Donabedian model of care. So what he basically did was break it down into what he calls this concept of structure, process, and outcome. And when you're trying to improve quality in particular healthcare quality, but you can use this model in other disciplines as well, you really want to look at all three elements and have ways to monitor, evaluate all three of these things. The structure, if it helps, is if you think of it as a game, and structure is the rules of the game. It's the playbook, how many team members you have, what uniforms you wear. So really the bones and the underpinning of the game. Process is the playing of the game, right? How you perform, what you do in order to play. And then the outcomes is basically who won. You know, did this, who had more points, right? That's an outcome measure. And so that's kind of the way to help frame when you're looking at ways to develop a QAPI program or a compliance plan, and you're looking, and you're trying to marry that with optimizing PDPM, is to look at these different elements and have ways to monitor each of these different sections. So what are some of the things that you would look at under structure? One is that you have appropriate staff, enough staff. I often used to smile because I would go on site and folks would tell me about this really great program or process that they have to ensure that their ADL coding was top notch. But the problem was they just didn't have any CNAs. So, if you don't have structure in place, it's kind of hard to move on process. But making sure that you have the appropriate staff, that they have the education they need to do what it is you need them to do. Here are the policies and procedures that we talked about. We need to have them for a compliance and ethics program. So, having them incorporate, checking to be sure that policies and procedures are the most current ones out on the unit. Those kinds of things are structural measures that you want to be able to capture when you're developing your plans. And you also, from a process perspective, would be more like, are the MDS, are they accurate? I'm going to test that the completion of the MDS leads to an accurate assessment. What's my process for communicating with physicians for proper ICD-10 codes? How do we do that? And then actually, do we execute on that process the way we intended it to be executed? And then again, what are the ICD-10 codes, and part and parcel with communicating with the docs, how are we making sure that we get those in a timely manner? And then one of the measures when you would be how to test that, right? And that would be a process quality measure. And then your outcomes is, what were the results, right? So the concept is if you have the structure in place and you have a good process, then your outcomes are going to be what you wanted them to be. But measuring them is a way to validate that. So what would outcome measures look like? Well, did my revenue go up? Did my revenue go down? Did my, 5-star improve based on my quality domains and staffing kind of thing? Are my quality measures improving? So that's the actual results. And that's how you would measure an outcome. So we talked early on in the discussion about the compliance and ethics program. We talked about what we need from a quality assurance performance improvement program. And then we talked about PDPM, the new payment methodology that's coming. And hopefully, as we walked through all that, you started to connect the dots, and you could see that under PDPM, compliance is going to be something that we're starting to hear more buzz about that. I think after folks digested what the new payment methodology is going to look like and sort of outlined what they thought of they could do in preparation, now it's a natural progression is to look to see, okay, how can we ensure that we're doing the right thing by way of reimbursement? Because we know that the feds are going to be looking, we know that the state surveyors are going to be looking. How can we ensure that we're doing that properly? And that, again, is a quality improvement program, and also ties in very naturally and neatly with a compliance plan. So it's really great with all of the regulations that we have to meet to see that we can actually use one thing to meet multiple needs in a particular center. Okay, so with that, I'm actually talked fast, so I'm done a little bit early. I wanted to thank you all for your attendance. Hope that you found some really good nuggets of information in my presentation that you can take with you and institute at your center or incorporate into existing programs that you have in place right now. And again, a shout out to your association for pulling together a really nice program, a great series on PDPM, hopefully preparing you for October 1st.
So thank you, Pam, for that excellent presentation. I just want to give one note before we close out. Today's slides are available under the Handouts tab on your control panel. So if you'd like to download those before you leave today, you're welcome to do that. If you have any trouble with that, just please email me. I'll certainly send them to you directly. Just wanted to make sure you're aware, if you do have follow-up questions, you can type them into that question box still now, or you can please email me directly at mmotiska@fhca.org. We will follow up with a Q&A document and make it available to all the attendees, and it will be on the website with the webinar recording. A really big thank you to our presenter today, Pam Kaiser of PointRight. We very much appreciate your time, Pam, and sharing your knowledge. We very much value as a partner, and thank you again for the excellent presentation. As always, we thank you for attending today's webinar and for your work to provide person-centered care in Florida. This concludes our webinar today, so have a great day, everyone. We'll see you soon. Thanks.